Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. I am your host for today, Father Wesley Walker, and today I'm joined by Kristen Rudd. Kristen is a writer and literature teacher who teaches her own classes online, serves as an adjunct professor for Thales College, and teaches some other classes for groups like Circe Institute. She holds a Master of Arts in Teaching and Classical Education through the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University, where she wrote her thesis on Dante's Divine Comedy. She's also the founder of a really cool organization called the Triangle Classical Forum, which hosts speakers and book discussions and all sorts of cool stuff down in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. So if you're ever down there, be sure to check in there. Kristen, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, this is going to be a lot of fun and a little different from what we normally do here at the Classical Mind. But before we get into our topic for today, which is monsters, I was just curious, what have you been up to lately?
Well, I take a break during the spring. I do two breaks. So I teach for 6 weeks and take a break, and then teach for 6 weeks and take a break. So this is my break week. So I'm doing a little bit of everything. I've been teaching my classes. I'm teaching this class on monsters currently for high school students. And I teach a class on the Divine Comedy. I'm also upcoming. I'll be speaking at the Circe Regional Conference in March. Not sure when this podcast will go live, but be one of the speakers for that at Thales College here in Wake Forest. And I'll be doing a webinar for Circe on Dante. So we just always have lots of projects rolling and cooking in the background.
Yes, you definitely stay busy.
Yes, I do.
Now, in all your busyness, what have you been reading lately?
So my monsters class just finished Beowulf. So I've been kind of heavy diving into Beowulf. And I've got a couple of books working. Been reading, I think it's Stephen Asma on monsters, which is really good so far. And then I can see it in my bag over there. Landscape with Dragons, I think it's called. There's a book on children's literature and the good and the bad in that. That's been really interesting. And then my Dante class, we're currently in Purgatorio, so I've been reading that. But the craziest thing I have read recently is just totally unrelated to our conversation. But I run a book club at my church, because I have to stay busy. And we just read The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, yeah.
And I had never read it before. And that book is bonkers, like bonkers. It was amazing.
That's fantastic. I love that. So you've alluded to it, and I mentioned that this is our topic for today. We're talking about monsters. And the reason for that is that you are teaching this class now for high school students, but is it my understanding that you're going to teach it again in the summer, but it'll be for adults?
Yes. So I've had this class on my syllabus for the year. It's just a spring semester course, so it's not a full year course. And got a few students. It's going well, but a lot of people expressed regret that they couldn't take the class. A lot of friends and things. And so I decided to offer a summer course for adults and teenagers if they'd like to join. Absolutely welcome. To do a little bit of an abbreviated course on some of these monster stories. So we won't cover quite as many things as the full semester class does, but it's it's a 12-week class covering some of the texts that we're covering in the monsters course. And we use texts from, the ancient Greeks through modern stories. So it's kind of an overview of the progression of how we view monsters throughout history in literature.
That's excellent. That's excellent. So I thought we could maybe step back and talk about some general questions about monsters then. These are some topics that have come up among our Classical Mind listeners and some of our conversations and in some of the books that we've read. The topic of monsters has come up. And so I thought it would be fun to talk with you a little bit, pick your brain about what monsters are and why they're important. So perhaps we could start by simply defining our term. What is a monster?
So that's a really interesting question. Like, it's way more complicated than you'd think.
It is.
It is. And I'm hesitant to give an answer because one of the really fun things about the class is the one I'm in currently is watching the students continue to grapple with that question. So as we read every story that we read, they kind of redefine and reevaluate what they believe a monster is and how different cultures and different stories portray what monsters are and how we're supposed to understand and read them. And I was going back through the discussion boards because I knew we were going to talk about this. And my students have classified monsters. They have a whole like medieval classification system going. They've divided monsters. This is from like the first week or two of class into 4 different categories. And then they've subdivided them. So they've identified at least kind of 2 main categories. And then from there kind of created more. But there's an idea that there is one type of monster that is completely evil, irredeemable monster. It is evil incarnate and should be destroyed, right? So, Grendel kind of falls into this category. Dragons would fall into this category. But then there's other types of aliens, yes. Which, well, I guess it depends.
I mean, the aliens from the film franchise Aliens.
Oh, from that film. Well, yeah, and I think whether or not something can be redeemed is an interesting question.
Right.
And whether or not you believe something is truly evil, in a society that increasingly doesn't believe in evil at all, then it raises a lot of really good questions. So they've kind of categorized this one broader category as the evil, and then they subdivided that into just like monsters that have no reason, and so they're just beasts, just absolute beasts. And then monsters that are evil but have reason but are still irredeemable. So it's interesting to see them kind of create these other categories for it, and then the redeemable monsters.
Interesting.
And so one of the first stories we read in the class with the students was Beauty and the Beast.
Sure.
And it's hard, I think, for us to separate the Disney movie version from the fairy tale, the original fairy tale. But the idea that Beast, they even questioned whether he was a monster or if he was just a monster on the outside. And so the idea that a monster could be redeemable, could be saved, is a really fascinating idea. And then they had like another category, kind of they're not really evil, they're just such beasts, like Godzilla.
Right.
So so they've been refining these as we go, and so it's been really fun to watch them come up with this definition. But that's one of the points of the class, is to read these stories and say, okay, so what does this story say about what it means to be monstrous or to be a monster? And how does the culture involved play into that? And how does that change and shift? And what should we do with that? So it's one of the big joys of the class.
You give me 1 second. I have to go get my son, who is woken up from his nap. Just give me 1 second.
Absolutely.
On your side, you can, or you can sit in the chair and listen and watch. But yeah.
I'll watch, Daddy.
Sit over me. All right. That's helpful. Those kind of preliminary definitions. I was wondering if maybe we could explore the difference between a villain and a monster. And you've already alluded to this slightly, because if the characters are redeemable or whatever, but obviously not all villains are monsters, and perhaps vice versa. So what is it that sets those two things apart?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know right now, like off the top of my head. I think I'm so steeped in monsters as villains that it's hard to think of a villain who's not monstrous. At least if he was, then is, redeemed. Darth Vader, is like the first one to come to mind, quite honestly. So seems very monstrous throughout, right? But then is redeemed in the end. So is he a monster, or was he, do monsters that, as part of the definition, do they have to stay monsters?
Sure, sure. And I suppose it does tie very closely to our definition of monster, and I think we're going to talk about this in a minute or two, but I think there is a sort of social aspect to what is a monster, insofar as monster tends to be other or outside of
Yes.
social norms. And so for that reason, I think that I think there has to be a distinction between villain and monster, because monster can really refer to almost anyone who's pushed outside of those social norms. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a bad intent necessarily, though often those two things do kind of overlap, I guess, in literature.
Yeah, I was reading in Asma's book this morning, and it's not a direct quote, but he had this really great point where he was making. I think he was talking about Frankenstein, and said it used to be that monsters were outside, you know, the community because they were evil,
Hmm.
and now monsters are evil because they're outside the community.
Right. You
And
get
so,
that.
that's been a shift in our idea of understanding, and wanting to make monsters relatable,
Hmm.
like the idea of relatability. And I think there's value in having them be both completely evil and unrelatable. There's good in that, like especially for children, right? So fairy tales, we want things to be very clearly good and very clearly evil. But then as we grow and we get older, and as what Solzhenitsyn says, the dividing line between good and evil runs through every heart.
Right.
And so, I think the ability to see our capacity for evil and our capacity to be a monster, and that's a frightening prospect. And so recognizing that we're all capable of monstrous things, and how do we fight against that? I think some of that shifts how we view monsters, and and then I think our lack of desire to recognize anything as evil. We make evil the byproduct of the outcast status rather than the other way around.
Sure, sure. This actually came up for me while reading Beowulf for the podcast
Mm,
a year or two ago, because I think it was when there's that scene where Grendel is sort of outside looking in, and you get the idea he sort of is hating what he's seeing, but one
yes.
wonders, did he already hate it, or is it because he's on the outside that he's hating it? And I don't know. It was an interesting question in my mind, and it kind of raised the question to me of well, what is it that the author is identifying here? Like, what are they inching into? And it's hard with Beowulf just because it's origins are so fuzzy. But anyways, but it definitely got me thinking on this topic. Now, since you kind of run the gambit here in terms of looking at monsters throughout the centuries, throughout different eras of literature, different social contexts, what is it that makes some of these monsters endure? I mean, there are just some so iconic, and they
Yeah.
might be ancient and they might be old, but we just, the Minotaur, for example. I mean, we all know who the Minotaur is, and it's from this, ancient mythology. So what makes them enduring?
I mean, who doesn't love a dragon, right? Like,
True.
well, and dragons, since I mentioned, they're in every culture,
Yeah.
kind of like a
If
pancake.
if Junius were here, he would have a lot to say about this, I'm
I
sure.
know. I thought of him too. Um, I think what makes them enduring is what any monster does, is they are so other, capital O other, that they help us feel better about ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, that there's something we can sit and look in them like a mirror and say that I'm not that. Thank God I'm not that. But there's this still little voice back in the back of our heads that, am I?
Right.
And so I think the more, crazy the monster, dragon, the Minotaur, Grendel, the easier it is for us to say, oh, I'm not that.
Mm. That is true. I guess in some ways, the definition of monster seems to always be tied to our understanding of hero, because heroes need to be defined over and against some sort of monster, at least
Yes.
often. So,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the Chesterton quote about children know, the bogey exists because they've been familiar with the dragon since they were born, right?
mm,
And that a fairy tale it always gets misquoted. Always, the Gaiman quote always gets mixed up in there. But Chesterton's point is that fairy tales don't just tell you that dragons can be killed. That's not his quote. His quote is, the fairy tale provides a St. George to kill the dragon.
That's right.
And so the fairy tale provides the hero that you can't kill a monster without a hero. And one of the things that I love about that, as a Christian, is you can't save yourself. You can't rescue yourself. So you need to be redeemed by an outside source. And so what the hero provides for us is that outside source to redeem and to save us.
That's helpful. And I love St. George. He's my patron saint, actually.
He is one of my favorites, yes.
Yeah, he's awesome. So I think that's helpful. So the thing that makes them endure is that they simultaneously comfort us and in some ways discomfort us. They show us who we are, but they also what we could be, and that can be scary. I guess that's why we depict them in such horrifying ways. They often embody cultural anxieties. I mean, it's very rare, I think, that you would have a monster, or perhaps we should say one of the enduring features of monsters is that they can play on a sort of collective anxiety, right? So it's not just my personal projection in a vacuum, but rather a good terrifying monster will speak to some sort of fear in a collective group, because that would give it more resonance. Does their depiction, and I guess we've talked about this a little, but it might be helpful to draw this out. Does the way we depict monsters then, is it more about what's out there, or is it more about what's in here?
Yes.
Exactly.
It's both. I mean, you talk about, monsters being enculturated. So I was thinking about like the Salem witch hunts, right? Like that's a societal fear, it was a societal fear. And, even Grendel, being outside the camp in a sense, it reflects back on this, this force that is against all of what's good. That's against, the hall, right? The mead hall as a symbol of kingship and authority and culture and, belonging. And so to destroy that is to destroy the culture. And so, like think about the witch hunts, which is not, there's a lot of literature written about it, but as a historical event, we create monsters to help us understand both, that other and who we are. I think it works both ways.
As you were just talking about that particular example, it made me think of the film The Witch that came out recently. I don't know, but not recently. It's been a while. Have you seen this?
No, I've not.
Okay, it's very good. It is one of the most unsettling films I've ever seen. But what's interesting about it, and I think to go back to this idea of collective anxiety, is that it's a telling of that kind of colonial era witch story for a modern audience.
Mm-hmm.
And so there aren't jump scares. There's not really a lot of it's not going to make you really jump out of your seat, but the sort of culmination of the film is the main character talking to a goat that she thinks might be possessed, and the goat talks back. And that is, I think, it plays on our collective anxiety because we live in a sort of secularizing world in which we've sort of dismissed, evil, like you said, and certainly spiritual realities. And so the film kind of confronts us with the question, well, what if it's real? And so that makes it very terrifying. But I think, again, showing us it's more about what's going on here, though certainly it's related to what's out there as well. It's very interesting. And so we see that monsters are often projections of ourselves or others. And we use that term, the other. Can we talk a little bit about how monsters can teach us about the dynamics of inclusion and inclusion? You said it used to be they're excluded because they're evil, but now they're evil because they're excluded. What is the shift there?
I mean, I think Frankenstein's a good marker for that. And Shelley's story is interesting because, she did revise it so much, from the 1818 text. Frankenstein is an other, but is he made a monster because he's created as one, or is he made a monster because he's been rejected by society and is not able to be included? And I think that's an interesting idea. Like, do we have less sympathy for a monster who's just evil and is excluded because of that just baseness? And it's easier to have sympathy for a monster who is evil because of that exclusion. And there's this idea almost, I think, and even on our secular society, that, well, we can fix it. We can bring it back into the fold. And this is a little, maybe, I don't know if this is a rabbit trail, but as I was mentioning witches, I was thinking about the idea that we've taken these monsters. One thing that is very common in our culture, my students have been really grappling with this, is we've taken these monsters, these depictions of evil, say a witch, right? Witches are evil. It's what fairy tales teach us. And we've turned them into these good things. It's like we have Harry Potter. I don't want to get into a Harry Potter debate. My family's read them. We love Harry Potter. We love the movies. We love the books. But we've taken this idea of evil and made it relatable and sympathetic and something that we root for. How to Train Your Dragon, right? Those books and the movies. We've taken this symbol of evil, the dragon, this destructive symbol, and we've made it something that we can tame. Or Monsters, Inc., right? Monsters under the bed, right? They're just going about their daily lives doing their work just like the rest of us, right? We've taken all of these symbols of evil and we've flipped them and made them into something good. And one of the things we've been discussing is that a good thing? Should we be concerned about that? And if so, why? And if not, why not? So the idea of, outcast and inclusion, I think it comes down to maybe how you view the world and how you view nature and reality. And I don't know that I have a good answer for it, because we are born into the context we're in, right? And so, but I think it raises some really good questions and some good things to grapple with and to discuss. And that's one of the things that we get to do in this course, is talk about those things. So
that is interesting. The witchcraft example is really interesting because I think not only a story like Harry Potter, I think you just go to Barnes and Noble and you get in like the spirituality aisle, and it's full of sort of witchcraft stuff, and it is very interesting. In fact, a lot of this conversation is reminding me of an edition of the Hedgehog Review that came out a few years ago. They did one on monsters, and there was a whole article in it about the sort of pop culture co-option of witchcraft and how it has become sort of a almost like a positive thinking, sort of self-affirmation way of being. Which is, I think, radically different than a lot of things that have come before. And so, yeah, you do get this kind of flipping. Some of it feels like,
and it's culturally based.
It is culturally
because
based.
Like, in Chinese culture, in their stories, dragons are good, right? And so a lot of it is culturally based. But in the Western culture, dragons are bad traditionally. So
I feel a little conflicted on the topic, and let me explain why.
Oh no.
That on the one hand, especially from a Christian perspective, there is good and then there's a lack of good. And that's certainly true. And we should be able to, I think, say that pretty without blushing. On the other hand, the emphasis on inclusion and the emphasis on empathy and the trying to understand where the monster comes from, these kind of questions, which have become more common, I think, in modern stories with monsters, strikes me as maybe a hollowed out or maybe a disenchanted Christian impulse. The idea of redemption being accessible, and the idea that exclusion may play a role in that. I'm torn, if that makes sense. That I think our culture would never acknowledge it as a Christian impulse, but I think that's where it comes from.
No, and I'm thinking, I think one of our hesitations in calling something evil is, who are we to say that someone or something is beyond redemption? And that's a fair assessment, right? Like, it's not up to us to judge the way that God judges, right? It's not up to us to condemn soul, right? That's one person gets that job, and he's God. So I think there's a hesitancy in wanting to say something is evil, because who are we to say that? But one of my students actually wrote in the discussion board this week, it's this great little quote. I wanted to share it. They were talking about, evil, and, is Grendel evil, or is he just, misunderstood? And she said that sometimes the villain of a story is just the villain. Rather than representing a complex human, which is what we would be, it represents the embodiment of that cosmic evil. These sorts of villains or monsters, I don't think ought to be intentionally made sympathetic. as pure evil is not and should not be sympathetic. And then she said this, and I love this: evil should be fought, not excused with a tragic backstory. And I think there's a hesitation from our culture, that kind of, you can do whatever you want as long as you're not harming anyone. It's very accepting culture that we live in. And the Christian view of, none of us are beyond redemption, right? We can all be saved, coupled with the idea that there is real evil in the world. So how do you identify it and name it? That's what some of the monstrous is. And it's so funny to watch my students be very hesitant to categorize too many of the monsters as that true evil, wanting to come up with that tragic backstory. But I think one of the things we need to remember is that while we can't judge to condemn any other person, we do have to judge. We have to make good judgments. We have to assess. Decision making is judgment, right? So in that sense, not in a condemning kind of way, but if something is evil, we should say that it's evil. And I think one of the things that monster stories help us do is recognize evil when we see it, and understand the complication of, being people who have the capacity for both good and evil, but being able to recognize it and acknowledge it and point it out and say that's monstrous.
Perhaps, yes, I think that's a super helpful way of sifting through some of those sometimes seemingly contradictory impulses. And I think that first and foremost, these stories can be so helpful. Yes, because they can help us recognize evil out there in the world, where it certainly is. But perhaps even more is that kind of internal or reflective move of that story is about an impulse that lives in here. It's about me. Just like I think I often encourage people in the scriptures that the passages about judgment, first and foremost, read those about yourself. That's about you, not about someone else. It's like Kierkegaard says, I'm sure you all will be saved. It's me I'm worried about, and I think that there's something to that approach. And so these stories are great because they can prevent me from becoming a monster.
Yeah, and what's interesting is when, as I've chosen stories, and I may not make exactly the same choices for the summer course. I may tweak it a little bit, but we start off with kind of very clear monsters, like Medusa, the Cyclops, the Minotaur, Grendel, dragons. And then we move into things where it gets more ambiguous, and we move into the realm of human, Frankenstein. I like to cover different monsters. So it's too long for the summer course, but we're doing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Like, who's not afraid of monsters in the deep, right? We're doing War of the Worlds, the monsters, aliens, so all the different kinds of categories. We're doing a bunch of short stories, and we get into some Poe and O'Connor and a few other short stories like that, where the monster is the man. We encounter men who are monsters. And I'm very curious to see how it's going to go, toward the end of the semester, as we move from what's very clearly the other, because it's not humanoid, to men who are monsters. And what do we do with that? And it seems like the more modern stories are about the monstrous man. But we love our Godzilla movies, right? We love our shark movies. Like, we love our alien movies. So.
Yeah, no. And in some ways, perhaps that's why these are the stories where humans are the monsters can be the more unsettling, precisely because that mirror becomes clearer. There's a little bit less of a distinction between that inhuman thing and me. We're reading right now with my oldest son. We've been reading The Magician's Nephew, and the way that Lewis describes Uncle Andrew at times, his face becomes contorted, or he gets this kind of almost demonic smile, as he's waxing eloquent about how the rules don't apply to him because he's a genius, and so that's very terrifying in a way that I can kind of just enjoy a nice alien movie or War of the Worlds or whatever. So
yeah, it's funny. On our book club, we read Ender's Game in January.
Oh.
Right. And, so Ender's Game is, the classic sci-fi novel, Orson Scott Card from 1977. And, they're fighting the buggers, right? The alien, and they're preparing for the third alien invasion. So they're going to defeat them once and for all. And so if you haven't read that, maybe skip ahead a little bit in the podcast, but, they defeat the aliens and then Ender realizes he doesn't even see them as monsters anymore. He ends up sympathizing with them. And so there's some interesting interplay there. Are we the other? Are we the monster for having destroyed them? So
The short
where's that
story of
dividing line?
the short story of I Am Legend is that way as well. Not the film, but the short story. He kind of realizes at the end that he's been the one who has been the monster, and not the actual, not who we thought were the monsters. And you also see this, I think, in that show on Netflix, Black Mirror. There's a whole episode where soldiers have certain implants where they see this group of people that they're supposed to exterminate as inhuman others, but actually once the technology malfunctions, you realize they're actually just humans, and so it certainly is. Yeah.
And then I mean, you look at heroes, and my students do not like some of these Greek heroes. They're not fans, because they don't embody Christian ethics and Christian virtue, right? They're proud and they're arrogant, and they're conceited, but for that culture, those were the values and the norms for a hero. And there's almost an idea that a hero in many contexts almost needs to be slightly monstrous himself. The hair of the dog that bit you kind of thing, right? Like, if you're not a little monstrous, can you defeat the monster? And when you look at the ancient stories, you see that, and the Christian story then flips that script on its head, because the ultimate monster, which is death and destruction, is defeated not through pride or arrogance. It's defeated through death. It's defeated through suffering. And so the Christian idea of a hero flips that pagan idea on its head, and turns from this bravado, this pride, into this humility. And so we're dealing with trying to look at these stories through that lens, and it's really hard, especially to get teenagers out of that lens, to like read a Greek heroic epic or a Greek play like a Greek and not a Christian.
I think that's one of the reasons why Batman has been a rather symbolic hero, is there's always that inner tension with him of realizing he could very easily become the thing he's fighting against.
Right.
And very conscious struggle against that. It's why he won't cross certain lines, and he has a sort of internal code of ethics that has to stay consistent. And I guess that's also the point of a story like Dune too, right? That the what happens when the heroes win is sort of the question it asks. And
I couldn't get into Dune. I've read the first book, and I don't think it's for me. So my daughter loves it.
I'm not a big fan.
And this is gonna, I don't know if this gets off topic, but Dexter, that TV show, right, about the man who is a serial killer, right? He's the hero in that show. Like, right. You root for the serial killer, so there's this really interesting juxtapositional play. Like, this man is a monster, and he embodies the monsters too. And he, his code is that he only kills killers. But there's this really, crazy interplay, and we root for this because we want those other killers to be punished, but not him. It's just, it's bizarre. It's very dark, but that idea of, to become the monster. I don't know, he'd be an anti-hero and say he's a hero, but we have now these kinds of stories.
That is an interesting kind of, I feel like it's related to this conversation, but that category of anti-hero and how they would fit in certainly marks, I think, a cultural blurring of lines, but I still think there might be something there in maybe a more positive way, that kind of maybe an anti-hero does some of what we're talking about here, which is they do kind of recognize who they are, and then are trying at least to do something like a Dexter, or I don't know. Did you ever see that show Barry? It's kind of similar. He's a
no
assassin who wants to become an actor. It's Bill Hader. It's a great show. But anyways, yeah. Yeah. So then why, as you're designing a course like this and creating objectives, and even just in the sort of pitch that you would make to someone as to why they should take the class, what are some of the important reasons for us, whether it's young adults who are high school students or lifelong learners, as to why they should study monsters?
Well, I mean, you should read really good books. So, reason number one.
We're on board with that at this podcast.
Yes. I feel like one of the most important questions we can be asking is, what does it mean to be human? And it's a question that we should constantly be asking. What does it mean to be human? And when we read great stories and we read great books, or even not great stories, honestly, we learn a little bit more about what that means. And so to understand that monster stories are, I think, a really great way and a really great genre of story to look at to help get at that question. And as an adult, the idea that we've talked about quite a bit is, where's that dividing line within my heart? Where are my monsters? I get teased because my son graduated high school last year and he had never read Where the Red Fern Grows. And so I handed it to him and I said, this is a book about a boy who's two dogs. You'll love it. So I put this on social media and everyone was like, you're a monster. And I thought it was so funny because I was like, keep people updated about where he was at in the book, and he was kind of on to me. He was like, it's going to end badly, isn't it? But I get called a wonderful person and also a monster. And so I think about this a lot. That monsters, they help us see who we are. And that we are fascinated with them. We are absolutely, as a culture, every culture, fascinated with monsters. Every culture has their own monsters. And so there's something about it that's compelling to us as humans. One of my favorite genre of movies is like a B-grade shark movies. Love them. Absolutely love them.
Thank you. Yes, me too.
I mean, the worse they are, the better, in my opinion. But these are just, these mindless, brainless monsters that, these people have to defeat and overcome. And so there's something about monster stories provides a testament to the power of the human spirit and the power of the hero and the power of our ability to overcome evil. Even if we don't recognize it as evil, we still do it. Because when you look at even the flipped stories, we're still rooting to overcome that evil. There's this little, I think it's Brigham Young University's animation department did this little 8-minute clip called Grendel. And it's beautiful, beautiful animation, but it follows Grendel as a monster. And, the Danes come and they build their hall and they're the monsters. They're the ones always attacking him. But then a dragon comes and attacks the hall. So even though they've made Grendel like the sympathetic main character, he still battles evil. And so even within the flipped stories, they're still battling evil.
Yeah.
So any flipped fairy tale, there's still, I tell my students every story is always about love. And so whenever I ask them, so what's the story about? They're always like, love. So, the power of the human spirit, the power of redemption, the power of salvation, the power of transformation are all at the root of monster stories and any other story. They're such a part of our culture that they're great to read and discuss and learn about what it means to be who we are and where we fit in this big, beautiful world.
Yes. So with that in mind, then, if people want to sign up for your class, where can and should they do that?
Yes. So it's a 12-week course, begins, I think, in late May and goes through August. You can go to kristenrudd.com. That's KristenRudd.com and go to the section on classes and sign up for the summer monster courses there. It's open to adults and teenagers. And if a high school student wanted to take it and get like a semester credit for a lit class, just let me know and I can make sure that they can get an appropriate level of work for a full course. I also have my classes for the next school year up. I'm still getting a couple of those up, but I'm doing Dante next year, and I'll be teaching an ancient and medieval philosophy course as well. And then I also do college coaching, and so I have the classicalcollegecoach.com if you're interested in parents who are interested in college coaching for their student, and that's the other stuff that I do there. So that's kind of where.
When you say college coaching, you mean like preparing for college, or is it like entrance essays, or what is the focus there?
Yeah, so I help students prepare for the CLT, the classical learning test, and we do a lot of college essay classes, and then just coaching, deciding where they want to go, what's a good fit, how do you do all of this and still maintain your sanity and rest and enjoy the good life now without it eating your soul.
Excellent. Very important. Very important. Well, I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't ask you one last question, which is, who is your favorite monster in literature or film? I think that would be acceptable to expand it to film.
Ooh, or film.
Or maybe you could do one of each.
Okay. So the Minotaur is my favorite monster.
Okay.
I love the Minotaur. It's my favorite Greek myth. So that would be my favorite monster. I want to say probably in film. I think I've just off the top of my head, I'm gonna have to go with Godzilla.
Okay.
I think mostly because several years ago, when one of the more recent Godzilla movies came out, my husband and I were watching it late one night, and my daughter came downstairs. She'd had a nightmare, and she was, I think, maybe 13, 14. She came downstairs crying because she'd had a nightmare. So we said, "Well, why don't you watch Godzilla with us?" And so we started it over at like 10 o'clock at night. So we watched Godzilla, and she felt better, and we were laughing because for a Godzilla movie, there was very little Godzilla.
Yeah.
But yeah, Godzilla is a good monster. And then the new Godzilla -1 is an absolutely phenomenal movie. And it's asking some great questions about what it means to be a man. And it's Japan post World War II, and they're fighting Godzilla, and there's a lot of really great interplays about what it means to be human, and what it means to love, and what it means to be a good citizen, and a good family member, and a good human, and a good man. So it's a really good movie. That's a good Godzilla movie.
Excellent.
So yeah,
Excellent.
the Minotaur and Godzilla.
I find I watch Godzilla movies on planes. I don't know. They always have them on the in-flight film thing, and I don't know. Like, I rarely would just sit down and watch one, but when I'm sequestered on a plane for a couple hours, I guess it's so.
I like alien movies. I don't like horror. I like movies about monsters. If it's something that's very clearly not human, it's not nearly as terrifying to me. Like movies that are scary where it's humans hurting humans, I have a really hard time with. Like, I can't deal with it. But movies about monsters, War of the Worlds, A Quiet Place, movies like that, where it's very clearly other monsters or ones that I can handle. So
Sure. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been a blast, and we'll be sure to put your website in the show notes so that if anybody wants to check out the classes, they can find those easily. So we really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
Listeners, thanks for listening, and in the meantime, keep reading.